park janitor was baffled by stray dogs digging at the same bench every morning until their paws bled. When he finally dug up the earth to see what they were after, the shocking discovery buried below didn't just stop his heart, it made him call the FBI immediately. Drop a comment with where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe to see what's coming up next. The frost on the iron gates of Oak Bridge Park had not yet melted when Andrew Trevor unlocked the padlock, the heavy chain rattling like a prisoner's shackles in the pre-dawn silence. At 72, Andrew moved with a stiffness that mirrored the old oak trees lining the promenade, his joints aching in sympathy with the damp earth. He adjusted his faded green work cap, pulling the brim low against the rising sun, and smoothed the front of his matching green uniform. It was a uniform that rendered him invisible to most of the city's inhabitants, a ghost in green who swept away their litter and raked their leaves. But to the park's wilder residents, he was the only human who mattered. For 40 years, Andrew had been a structural engineer, dealing with the physics of load-bearing walls and the sheer strength of concrete. He understood how things were built and, inevitably, how they fell apart. After his wife, Martha, died 5 years ago, the silence of his empty house became too loud to bear. He had taken the job at Oak Bridge, not for the money, but for the noise of the wind in the leaves and the absence of complex calculations. Here, the problems were simple: a broken slat, a clogged fountain, a pile of autumn leaves. Or so he had thought until the digging started. The anomaly began on a Tuesday, subtle enough that anyone without Andrew's obsessive attention to detail would have missed it. As he pushed his cart toward the Old General, a 300-year-old white oak that anchored the eastern sector of the park, he saw them, the pack. They were a motley crew of 4 strays that Andrew had quietly adopted from a distance. There was a scruffy terrier mix, a nervous border collie, a one-eared boxer, and their leader, Buster. Buster was a magnificent, if emaciated, golden retriever shepherd mix with a coat the color of dried wheat. Usually, when Andrew approached, the pack would scatter into the brush, waiting for him to leave a discreet pile of kibble near the tree line. Today, they didn't scatter. They didn't even look at him. They were clustered around bench 42, a wrought iron and wood structure bolted into the earth beneath the old general's massive canopy. Buster was on his belly, his front paws working furiously, sending plumes of dark soil flying backward. The other dogs paced around him, whining with a pitch that vibrated with anxiety rather than aggression. "Easy now," Andrew murmured, parking his cart 10 feet away. "What's got into you, boy? Squirrel go to ground?" Buster paused, his sides heaving. He looked up at Andrew, and the intelligence in the dog's amber eyes was unsettling. There was no playfulness there. It was a look of desperate, frantic necessity. The dog gave a low, mournful woof, then immediately returned to digging, his claws scraping against a root with a sound like a nail on a chalkboard. Andrew stepped closer. The ground beneath bench 42 was historically problematic. As an engineer, he knew the soil composition here was dense clay, compacted by decades of foot traffic. It was hard as concrete. Yet Buster was tearing at it as if his life depended on what lay beneath. "All right, that's enough," Andrew said gently, clapping his hands. "Shoo, you're tearing up the grass." The pack retreated, but they didn't run. They moved 10 yards away and sat, watching him, waiting. Andrew sighed, grabbing his rake to smooth over the shallow hole Buster had created. As he packed the dirt back down, a faint, strange scent drifted up. Not the smell of wet earth or decay, but something sharper, sweeter. It vanished before he could place it. He dismissed it as a trick of the pollen-heavy air, unaware that he had just brushed the surface of a mystery that had been festering in the dark for half a century. By Friday, the situation had escalated from a nuisance to a crisis. Every morning, Andrew arrived to find the hole deeper. He would fill it in. By noon, the dogs would be back. By evening, the hole was a tripping hazard again. The escalation wasn't just in the depth of the hole, but in the desperation of the animals. It was mid-afternoon when the conflict finally snapped. The park was busy with the lunch crowd. Young mothers with strollers, office workers eating sandwiches, joggers stretching their hamstrings. Andrew was emptying a trash bin near the playground when a piercing scream cut through the ambient noise. He dropped the liner and ran, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement. He found a young woman clutching her toddler to her chest, backing away from bench 42. "Get away! Get back!" she screamed. Buster was there, ignoring her entirely. He was digging. But the sight that stopped Andrew cold was the blood. The soil around the bench was smeared with crimson. Buster's paws were raw, the pads torn open by the relentless friction against the hard-packed clay and stone. He was literally grinding his own feet to the bone to get to whatever was down there. "Hey, get!" Andrew shouted, this time with command in his voice. He waved his arms, placing himself between the woman and the dogs. Buster looked up, panting, blood dripping from his right paw. He didn't growl at the woman. He looked at Andrew, let out a high-pitched yelp of pure frustration, and then, sensing the gathering crowd, signaled the pack to retreat. They vanished into the rhododendrons. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Andrew asked, turning to the woman. "Those animals are rabid," she shrieked, her face pale. "Did you see that? It was trying to bury itself. It's insane. I'm calling the city." "They weren't attacking," Andrew tried to explain, looking at the bloody paw prints on the pavement. "They're looking for something. I don't care what they're doing. My son plays here." 20 minutes later, Rick Henderson, the park supervisor, rolled up in his white utility truck. Henderson was a man who viewed nature as a spreadsheet. Trees were assets and animals were liabilities. He slammed the truck door and marched over to where Andrew was washing the blood off the pavement with a hose. "Trevor," Henderson barked, "third complaint this week. And now Mrs. Gable says there's a bloodbath at bench 42. "The dogs are hurting themselves, Rick," Andrew said, turning off the water. "They aren't aggressive. They're desperate. Buster, the big one, he's torn his pads off digging." "I don't care about the mutt's pedicure," Henderson said, adjusting his sunglasses. "I care about lawsuits. I've already called animal control. They're coming Monday morning with the catch poles. They're clearing the park." Andrew felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The local shelter was a high-kill facility. A dog like Buster, big, old, and now labeled aggressive by a terrified mother, wouldn't last 24 hours. "You can't do that," Andrew said. "Give me the weekend. I'll figure out what's drawing them there. It's got to be a dead animal, maybe a gas leak. Something is triggering them. If I remove it, they'll stop." Henderson looked at his watch, then at the bloody dirt. "You have until Sunday night. If that bench area isn't pristine and those dogs aren't gone by Monday at 8 a.m., I'm letting the catchers loose. And Andrew, if you break a hip digging for imaginary bones, that's on you. Workers' comp doesn't cover chasing ghosts." Andrew watched the truck drive away. He looked down at bench 42. The old general loomed above, its branches swaying in a sudden gust of wind. The dogs were watching from the tree line, silent sentinels. Andrew nodded to them. "Hold on, boys," he whispered. "We're going to find it." He waited until the sun dipped below the horizon on a Saturday evening. The park gates were locked, the joggers gone. The only light came from the amber glow of the street lamps filtering through the leaves. Andrew went to the maintenance shed and bypassed the rakes and brooms. He reached for the heavy-duty pickaxe and the long-handled steel shovel. He parked his cart next to bench 42 and set up 2 battery-powered floodlights, casting harsh, long shadows across the grass. He unbolted the bench first, using his ratchet set to remove the heavy iron nuts that held it to the concrete footings. With a grunt of exertion that made his lower back scream, he dragged the heavy bench aside. Now the earth was bare. Andrew spat on his hands and swung the pickaxe. Thwack. The ground fought back. It wasn't just dirt. It was a geologic history of the city. The top 3 inches were loam and mulch, easy enough, but below that lay the hard pan, dense gray clay that had been compressed by 50 years of picnics, lovers' quarrels, and solitude. Every swing of the pickaxe sent a shockwave up Andrew's arms, rattling his teeth. 1 hour passed, then 2. He was 2 feet down, standing waist-deep in a grave of his own making. Sweat soaked his uniform, turning the green fabric black. His breath came in ragged gasps. He paused to drink from his thermos, his hands trembling. "Why are you doing this, old man?" he asked himself. Go home, watch TV. But then he heard it, a rustle in the bushes. He looked up to see Buster sitting just outside the circle of the floodlights. The dog wasn't digging anymore. He was watching Andrew with an intensity that felt almost human. It was a transfer of duty. "I can't dig anymore," the dog seemed to say. "It's your turn." Andrew picked up the shovel. At 3 feet, the soil composition changed. He hit a layer of rocky fill, construction debris from when the park was terraformed in the 90s. And then, at 3.5 feet, the shovel blade didn't sink. It rang. Clang. It wasn't the dull thud of a rock. It was the hollow, resonant ping of metal. Andrew dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain in his joints. He switched to a hand trowel, scraping away the clay with frantic movements. The beam of his headlamp cut through the dust. He revealed a surface. It was rusted, pitted with corrosion, but undeniably manufactured. It looked like the lid of an industrial lockbox about 2 feet wide. It was wrapped in layers of thick black plastic, but the plastic had disintegrated over the decades, exposing the metal beneath. Andrew cleared the edges. The box was sealed. Not just locked, but sealed. A thick, yellowish substance caked the seam where the lid met the body of the box. He took his utility knife and scraped at the substance. The smell hit him instantly. It was the same scent he had caught earlier, but concentrated 1,000 times over. It was a rich, fatty animal smell, rancid yet preserving. Beef tallow, Andrew realized, and beeswax. It was an old-school method of waterproofing, something farmers used to do. But why seal a metal box with fat? And then it clicked. The dogs. They hadn't been digging for the metal. They had been digging for the fat. For decades, the metal had held the scent in, but as the rust ate through, the smell of the tallow had begun to bleed into the soil, driving the starving animals into a frenzy. Andrew used the pickaxe to pry at the rusted latch. It groaned, the oxidized metal protesting the movement. With a final, heaving yank, the latch snapped. Andrew hesitated. The air in the park suddenly felt very still. The crickets had stopped chirping. He lifted the lid. He expected money. He expected drugs. He expected, perhaps, the bones of a small animal. What he saw made no sense. The box was lined with decaying straw. Nestled in the straw were rows of glass vials, 51 of them to be exact. They were vintage apothecary bottles, stopped with corks that had also been dipped in wax. The liquid inside was clear, viscous. Andrew reached in and picked up one of the vials. The label was yellowed, the typewriter ink faded but legible under his headlamp. Thallium sulfate, Tl2SO4, 99% pure. Andrew's engineering background included a mandatory year of chemistry. He knew what thallium was. In the mid-20th century, it was used as rat poison and an ant killer, but it was banned in the 70s for a reason. It was tasteless, odorless, and soluble in water. It was the poisoner's weapon of choice. It was a heavy metal that attacked the nervous system, causing hair loss, agony, and eventual respiratory failure. He looked at the box. There was enough thallium here to kill half the city. And then he saw the newspaper clipping tucked into the side of the box. It was damp, fragile as a moth's wing. The headline, dated October 14, 1974, read, "Police Baffled by River Valley Deaths." Andrew dropped the vial back into the straw as if it were a live coal. He scrambled out of the hole, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for his cell phone, his dirty fingers smearing the screen. He didn't call Henderson. He didn't call the police department's non-emergency line. He dialed 911. "Emergency." The operator's voice was calm. "This is Andrew Trevor. I am at Oakbridge Park. I need the FBI. "Sir, is there an immediate danger?" "I just found Julian Vane's stash," Andrew whispered, his voice trembling. "I found the poison." The response was not the wailing of sirens, but the silent, terrifying arrival of the specialists. Within an hour, Oakbridge Park was not a park anymore. It was a biological hazard zone. The local police arrived first, setting up a perimeter, but once Andrew used the words thallium and Julian Vane, the command structure shifted rapidly. By 2 hot a.m., black SUVs with government plates had rolled over the manicured lawns. Men and women in full-level B hazmat suits, thick rubberized gear with respirators, were descending into the hole Andrew had dug. Andrew sat on the bumper of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee. He watched the scene unfold with a detached surrealism. The floodlights were blinding now, turning the night into a sterile, white day. "Mr. Trevor?" He looked up. A woman stood before him. She wasn't wearing a hazmat suit, but a blue FBI windbreaker over a sharp suit. She was young, perhaps mid-30s, with eyes that were scanning him for deception. "I'm Special Agent Elena Rostova," she said, extending a hand. "I'm with the Behavioral Analysis Unit, Cold Case Division. They woke me up for this." Andrew shook her hand. His grip was gritty with dirt. "Did I do wrong digging it up?" "You might have saved the water table," Rostova said, sitting next to him on the bumper. "If that box had rusted through completely and we had a heavy rain, that amount of thallium could have leached into the groundwater. You didn't just find a souvenir, Mr. Trevor. You found a chemical weapon." She pulled out a tablet. "The lab boys are already testing the seal. You were right. Beef tallow and beeswax. It's an airtight seal, archaic but effective. It's also exactly how Julian Vane sealed his preserves." Julian Vane. The name hung in the air like smoke. "I remember the fear," Andrew said softly. "I was in my 20s. People stopped drinking tap water. They stopped eating at potlucks. He killed 7 people, they said." 11 confirmed, Rostova corrected. 14 suspected. He died in prison in '98. Took his secrets with him. We never found the source. We knew he worked at a chemical supply warehouse, but we never found where he hid the inventory. The dogs found it, Andrew said, looking toward the animal control van that had arrived. Where are they taking them? Rostova followed his gaze. They're evidence now, technically. They found the site. They're good dogs, Andrew said, his voice hardening. They were starving. They smelled the fat in the seal. They were trying to eat the wax. That's why they dug until they bled. They weren't mad. They were hungry. Rostova looked at Andrew, really looked at him, seeing the exhaustion and the quiet integrity in his face. I'll make a call. We'll have them held at a secure vet facility, not the pound. No kill order. I need you to walk me through the dig. As Andrew recounted the mechanics of the excavation, a thought nagged at him. The engineer in him was waking up. Agent Rostova, he said, pointing at the hole, that box was 3.5 feet down, below the fill line. So, this park. It was built in 1995. Before that, this was just a wooded lot, undeveloped. If Vane buried that in the 70s, he dug deep. But look at the orientation. Andrew gestured to the old general. He didn't just bury it in the woods, he buried it exactly where the bench is now, the bench that was installed 20 years later. Rostova narrowed her eyes. Coincidence? I don't believe in coincidence when it comes to concrete, Andrew said. Someone put that bench there, exactly there, to cap it, to make sure no one ever dug there by accident. A bench is a permanent marker. You don't dig under a bench. Rostova stood up, her posture stiffening. You're saying he had help? Someone who knew where the bodies were buried? Literally. I'm saying, Andrew said, standing up to join her, that Julian Vane has been dead for 20 years, but whoever placed that bench knew exactly what they were covering up. The sun rose on a town that was no longer sleeping. The news vans were circling the park perimeter like vultures. The headline had leaked. Poison cache found in Oak Bridge. The psychological impact on the town was immediate and visceral. For the older generation, the River Valley poisoner was the boogeyman of their youth. The discovery of the poison ripped open scabs that had been healing for decades. Crowds gathered at the police tape. It wasn't the usual gawkers. These were solemn, fearful people. Among them, Andrew saw faces he recognized from the grocery store, the gas station. He saw Sarah Jenkins, a woman his age whose younger brother had been Vane's first victim. She was staring at the hazmat tent, clutching a handkerchief, tears streaming down her face. Andrew felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was the man who had opened Pandora's box. By mid-morning, the conflict over the dig site had turned political. Mayor Higgins, a man whose primary concern was property values, was arguing with Rostova near the command tent. Andrew was sweeping nearby, a habit he couldn't break, and heard the exchange. "Get it out, fill it in, pave it over," Higgins was saying, his face red. "I want this park open by Wednesday. This is a disaster for the city's image." "Mr. Mayor," Rostova's voice was ice, "this is a federal crime scene. We're not filling anything in until we clear the area." "You found the box. What else is there?" Andrew stepped forward, leaning on his broom. "The trophies," he said. The mayor turned. "Who is this?" "The man who found it," Rostova said. "Go on, Mr. Trevor." "Serial killers keep tokens," Andrew said, remembering the documentaries he'd watched. "Vane didn't just kill for fun, he killed for control. If he buried his weapon here, he buried his memories here. And, if I'm right about the soil, the ground has settled unevenly over there." He pointed to a spot 5 feet to the left of the original hole, closer to the roots of the old. "General, the root structure acts like a net," Andrew explained. "If you dig there, the soil loose. It's been disturbed more recently than the clay around it. Maybe not 50 years ago, maybe 30. Rostova looked at the mayor. "We're bringing in the GPR, ground-penetrating radar. If the ground scans show an anomaly, we dig. If not, you get your park back." The GPR unit arrived at noon. It looked like a lawnmower pushed by a technician. As they rolled it over the spot Andrew indicated, the monitor spiked. A jagged red blotch appeared on the screen. "Anomaly detected," the technician said. "Depth 4 feet. Object density organic and metallic." Rostova looked at Andrew. "Get the backhoe." Andrew shook his head. "No machinery, not this close to the old general's roots. We'll kill the tree. We dig by hand." Rostova nodded. She grabbed a shovel. "Then we dig." It took 3 hours. The silence of the crowd outside the tape was heavy. When the shovel hit the second box, the sound was duller. This wasn't a metal lock box. It was a rot-resistant polymer case, the kind used for fishing tackle. When they opened it, there was no poison. Inside was a rotting leather ledger and a collection of plastic Ziploc bags. Andrew looked away as Rostova held up the first bag. It contained a driver's license. Thomas Jenkins, Sarah's brother. Rostova opened the ledger. She scanned the pages, her face paling. "This isn't just a trophy case," she whispered. "It's a payment log." "Payment?" Andrew asked. "Vane wasn't working alone," she said, her voice tight. "Or at least, he wasn't acting without support. Look at these dates. The last entry is dated 6 months after." Vane was arrested. She turned the book toward Andrew. The handwriting changed halfway through. From Vane's frantic scrawl to a neat, precise architectural script. Someone was maintaining the stash, Andrew realized. Someone kept the secret. He looked out toward the crowd beyond the police tape. The faces of the townspeople were a blur, but one figure stood out. A man standing apart from the others, leaning heavily on a cane. He wasn't looking at the hazmat tent. He was looking at the tree. He was looking at the bench. It was Arthur Abernathy, the former city planner, the man who had designed the layout of Oak Bridge Park in 1995. Andrew felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He dropped his shovel. "Agent Rostova," he said quietly. "Don't look now, but I think the man who placed that bench is watching us." Rostova signaled her team with a subtle hand gesture, but Andrew was already moving. He walked toward the police tape, toward Abernathy. He didn't run. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had nothing left to lose. Abernathy saw him coming. The old man didn't run. He couldn't. He just gripped his cane tighter, his knuckles white. "Hello, Arthur," Andrew said as he reached the barrier. "Andrew," Abernathy's voice was dry as dust. "You always were a hard worker. I told them to fire you years ago. Said you were too old. They didn't listen." "You put the bench there," Andrew said. It wasn't a question. Abernathy looked at the hole in the ground, at the FBI agents carefully cataloging the sins of the past. "Vane, he was my brother-in-law. Did you know that?" "No one knew. We had different names." "You knew what was in the box." "I knew he had buried materials," Abernathy whispered. "I didn't know it was 50 vials. I thought it was tools, knives. I was young. I was scared." He told me if I ever told anyone, the stash would be found and my sister would be implicated. So you protected it, Andrew said, disgust rising in his throat. You became the city planner. You waited until the land was developed, and you placed Bench 42 right on top of it, a concrete cap. I was sealing it in, Abernathy hissed, tears forming in his milky eyes. I was trying to keep it safe. If a construction crew had hit that with a bulldozer back in '95, the cloud, it would have killed the workers. I thought I was doing the right thing, bearing the past. You weren't bearing the past, Arthur, Andrew said, his voice trembling. You were bearing the truth. Sarah Jenkins has waited 40 years to know where her brother's ID was. You let her wait. I was afraid, Abernathy wept. And the dogs? Andrew asked. The dogs smelled the fat. They were trying to tell us. And you watched them dig. You knew what was down there. You were going to let animal control kill them to keep your secret. Abernathy said nothing. He just hung his head. Behind Andrew, Rostova approached, flanked by 2 officers. She didn't need to ask. She had heard enough. Arthur Abernathy, she said, her voice carrying the weight of the federal government. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact to capital murder. As they handcuffed the old planner, he looked at Andrew one last time. I just wanted peace, Andrew. Quiet. There's no peace in a lie, Andrew said. The aftermath was a slow, quiet exhalation. It took 3 days to clear the site. The soil was tested, treated, and replaced. The hazmat tents came down. The news vans moved on to the next tragedy, but Oak Bridge was different now. Lighter. The revelations in the ledger closed 12 cold cases. Families who had spent decades wondering why and where finally had answers. Julian Vane was a monster, but he was a monster whose teeth had finally been pulled. A month later, the park reopened. Andrew was back in his green uniform, sweeping the leaves from the path. The air was crisp, signaling the arrival of autumn. He walked toward the old general. Bench 42 was gone. In its place stood a new bench made of sustainable teak, paid for by the donation of an anonymous benefactor, though everyone knew it. Roy was Sarah Jenkins. The plaque read, "For those we lost and for those who found them." Andrew sat on the bench. He took a sandwich out of his pocket. A rustle in the bushes. Buster emerged. He looked different. His coat was brushed, shining like gold in the sun. He had gained 10 pounds. He wore a red collar with a tag that jingled as he trotted over. Andrew had cashed in his favor. The mayor, desperate to save face, had granted Andrew full custody of the pack, waiving all fees and restrictions. The terrier and the collie had been adopted by Rostova's sister. But Buster was Andrew's. The big dog approached the bench. He didn't dig. He didn't sniff at the ground. The smell of the tallow was gone, replaced by the clean scent of fresh earth and grass. Buster hopped up onto the bench beside Andrew, resting his heavy head on the old man's knee. Andrew stroked the dog's ears, feeling the scar tissue where the cuts on his paws had healed. "We did. Good, boy," Andrew whispered. "We cleaned it up." Buster let out a long, contented sigh and closed his eyes. Andrew looked out over the park. He watched the children playing, the runners running, the life continuing. He realized then that he had spent 5 years mourning his wife, thinking that his life was just a slow march toward the end. But the earth had offered him a choice, to let the rot fester or to dig it out. He had dug, and in the process he had found something better than thallium or gold. He had found a reason to wake up before the sun. "Come on, Buster," Andrew said, standing up and grabbing his broom. "Leaves won't rake themselves." Man and dog walked down the path together, leaving the old general to stand guard over a ground that was, finally, just dirt.